what I'm going to do is take a little bit of that, take that same question, but look at it from the perspective of insects and their flows across the landscape. And when I say insects, I also include spiders. And one of the reasons I do this is if you ever go out like the first early warm days of spring or the last warm days of autumn, there's often like this clouds of insects in the air. And those are insects moving back and forth. And that's really what makes me think of insects as a flow. And just to explain this a little bit more, you can imagine there's a population of insects in the landscape, and it's almost like a puddle. It's almost like a reservoir of insects out there, and it waxes and wanes, and maybe they move into another place, and they move out there. So this is how I'm thinking about insects in the landscape. And when you start wanting to conserve some of them because they're rare, because you want beneficials, one thing you can do is preserve their habitat, improve their habitat, make more of them that way. But if you're also thinking in terms of this context of having them come into, say, a plowed field, then what you might need to do is actually build out, as Claudia was talking about, some of these hedgerows and draw them out as guideposts into that landscape and finally manage this field in a way that is compatible with them. So thinking about how you're going to actually tap that flow of organisms across the landscape, and perhaps because we're right near the dam here, I think of this in terms of a mill. So in some ways, you want to have this mill. You want to be able to take advantage of that flow of insects across the landscape by creating a so-called mill. And you imagine at the same time, there's not just one type of insect out there. There's spiders out there. There's other types of insects, some of whom you also hope that you can take advantage of in an agronomic sense, some of which, like the plum curculio down here around the orchard, you actually want to keep out. But again, it's managing this flow. And so that's kind of the background for how I'm thinking about this. And I really shouldn't gesture with my hands when I'm holding a microphone. And these are the 4 parts of the talk: identifying the watershed, where in the landscape are those beneficials coming from; mapping the water courses, what do we know about distance and timing of these flows or movements; controlling the flow, erecting the dams; how do we bring these insects to where we want them; and then finally a little bit of that context. And none of this is going to be enough. It's all going to be in frustratingly little detail. But the idea is just to help you think about insects and some of these issues from this perspective. So starting out with identifying the watershed. So if you were actually doing hydrology, you'd be looking at your dam here and what's happening upstream. How does that influence the flow of water by it? And analogously, if we're thinking about a crop field here where you're trying to take advantage of the beneficials, the pollinators or the pest predators, what's happening in essentially the watershed or the landscape around that? Do you have sources of beneficials in these different habitats that you might want to try to encourage? And so we have actually gone into those habitats and looked at the insects in those habitats. And what you find is some habitats are good for some insects, some habitats are good for other insects. No one habitat fits all. So you've got a lot of spiders in the wetlands, for example, a lot of ground beetles in the crop fields, wasps like the woods. And if you're thinking about having a situation in which you want to have a lot of beneficial insects, you probably need to think about a watershed or the surrounding habitats, in other words, that are diverse in terms of habitats. Does that make sense so far? So I'm going to look at this a little bit more closely by looking at ground beetles. And as Anne alluded to, I do fiddle with ground beetles. And so ground beetles are nice because they're beneficial insects. They're thought to be weed seed predators, pest predators, but they also occur in very discrete communities in the landscape. So you have a wetland community of ground beetles, you've got a field community of ground beetles, you've got a forest community of ground beetles. And when you start looking at these across the landscape, you can make what are essentially, these are like a family tree of ground beetle communities. So what I'm showing here is how closely related these different communities are. So a community like a hemlock and a northern hardwood forest, the ground beetle communities in those habitats are very similar to each other, whereas something like a pasture and a hemlock forest, those ground beetle communities are very different. And this is work we've done in Columbia County, looking at ground beetles in all these different areas. But the point is, if you want to have more beneficial ground beetles in the crops, for example, well, maybe one thing you want to do is have more of those sorts of habitats in the surroundings, because those are the ones that will actually share potentially the ground beetle communities with the crop fields. So looking at this landscape and imagining the flows across it, you can imagine the shrublands, for example, may be providing more ground beetles, more beneficials to the adjacent cropland than perhaps some of the other habitats here. And if we want to look at this a little bit more closely and get a better idea of what these flows actually look like, we can look at that interface between the wilder area and the fields. And I'm going to stick with ground beetles for this, but the question here is, to what degree do the beneficials in this woodier, wilder area here overlap with the beneficials, and in this case the ground beetles, that are actually out in those fields? And the way we did this is we had traps that we set up in the field, in the woods themselves, at the edge, 300 feet, 600 feet in, and we caught the beetles in those various distances into the fields. And you find some cases you have a species like this, which is only found in the woods. This little bar shows you its abundance. You have species like this, which are only found in the field. And then if you start adding these up, you realize some are found in both areas, field and forest. And these are just, don't worry at all about all the names, but this is just doing it for most of our common ground beetles, showing you that you have some groups up here that are really only woodland species. You have some species like these, which are only field species. And then you have what I'm calling the commuters, which are the species that occur in the forest and then out in the field as well. And it's really, if you're talking about trying to promote in-field beneficials by having wild habitat, it's these commuters that are probably the ones that you'd be focusing on. And many of them are quite common, which implies that this could be a useful way of approaching this. And then just to show you, it also works for bees. You have this same group of commuter species. So the first take-home message, even within collections of creatures that we usually consider as groups, there is substantial variation in habitat use. What do you want? What do they need? This is some of the questions you might bring to management. And also a greater diversity of habitats, as I mentioned, might promote a greater diversity of beneficials in the landscape. So mapping the watercourses. What do we know about distance and timing of these movements or flows? Just to give you a little bit of a feel for what it means when you have these flows of insects across the landscape. Apple. And I want to start that out by just something that Claudia had alluded to, but where do insects pass the long, dark, cold nights of winter? We sort of think that we go home, we go out of the field, and they must go home and go out of the field too. But of course, they have to most of them pass their winters actually in the field. And one of the ways we looked at that is by setting up these little, they're called emergence traps. The insects come up out of the ground in spring as they're waking up. And we've looked at what habitats are the best overwintering areas for these insects. And what we found, for example, is this type of rocky edge tends to be really good. This beetle bank may certainly get better as it matures. But this just gives you a little bit of an idea, thinking about the starting points of where these insects are coming from. And once they wake up, what do? This was some work that Martin Holdridge, a high school student, did with us. This shows spring ephemerals down here in a floodplain forest. Below there's a crop field up here, but in early spring, you've got the bees down here on bloodroot, on trillium, that sort of thing. And then as the season progresses, they come up into the crop fields, and actually by July, they're up here doing a fair bit of the pollination. And if you look at the numbers of the species themselves, you find about a quarter of these species that are here in July started out the season down here. So this is just an example of these connections between wilder areas and the crop areas. Now, can we look at this flow? Can we actually detect this flow a little bit better? And the way we do this is we have what's called a four-headed Malaise trap, where we have insects flying in, and we can detect which side they're coming from, when they're coming from the wilds or they're coming from the crop side. And this is just showing that again. And what we find if we looked at where the insects are coming from is that actually the captures from the wild side of these traps tend to be a lot larger than the captures from the crop sides, implying that you actually may have a movement coming out of the wilder areas. These arrows, so in the case of native bees, you had about 80% of the captures were on the wild side and only 20% were on the crop side. And you can see that in general, most of the organisms are coming from the wild side. You can look at this a little bit more detail by looking at how insects actually move out into the fields. And this was work we did, the same work that I showed you with the ground beetles, where we have these sampling points moving into a field. And the question was, how does the abundance of these organisms change over that gradient? And what you see, here's the edge, here's the relative abundance. You've got bees here, wasps, lady beetles. And you see that early in the season, indeed, you've got a lot more insects close to that edge, perhaps where they're flowing out of. Fewer out here. As the season progresses, however, interestingly, that tends to level out. And so you're getting this, again, change in the pattern over the seasons. One way you can look at that in more detail is by comparing this number, the abundance at the edge, to the average abundance out here in the field. And if you look at that over the season, you get an image like this, which shows that early in the season, you have a lot more insects on the edges of the field. That's because it's above 1. If it were 1, it would be the same on the edge as in the field. You have a lot more insects on the edges of the field. By the time you get to midsummer, that's about balanced out. And then in fall, you have the same thing repeating itself. So just trying to give you a little bit of the dynamics of how these flows are happening. So take home number 2, we do have evidence of some of these flows. We have the seasonal tide of life across the farms, and managing so as to receive that flow in the spring and have your reservoirs in the winter is something to think about. Understandable so far? A chance for questions. Controlling the flow, erecting dams and sluices. So taking this, I'm really beating this dead horse, this analogy of the mills, but thinking about it in terms of the flows of insect. You saw this picture before. This is the picture of the trial plots that Claudia showed. And so if you remember, she had 3 different treatments. She had a flowery seed mix, a grassy seed mix, and then our fallow areas. And we went in and we looked at the insects. Are they actually supporting insects in the way that we hoped they would be? And indeed, what we find is our flowery mix does have the highest numbers of lady beetles, hoverflies, long-legged flies, which are predatory, wild bees, also butterflies, which I didn't put up there. The fallow has micro-wasps, a lot of pests, actually, and the grassy area tended to be the best for spiders and weevils. So just giving you a little bit of feeling about the insect populations. But the question is really, are they doing anything? So what? I mean, it's nice if you're an entomologist, you get excited about it, but so what in terms of production? So we planted squash and broccoli beside each of these plots to see if there was any effect. And there's the squash growing up. There's some nice, the flowers. And what we found, these are the results, seed mix A, seed mix B, the fallow control. This is the number of ripe squash. Well, a bit more ripe squash next to the fallow control. There's the mean weight, a bit bigger next to the fallow control. And then total harvest indeed was bigger, or there was more total harvest next to the fallow control. That wasn't what we were expecting. I'm going to try to explain it a little bit, but I don't have absolute answers. So it turns out those plants next to the fallow control were bigger and they had more squash. It may be because you had less pest damage. This is the chart showing the damage, and indeed you had less pest damage next to the fallow control. Perhaps if you remember, it could be because you have a lot of these micro-wasps there, and those wasps help control some of the pests. So that might be part of it. It may also be that those fallows they tended to have a lot of those small flowers like the horseweed that Claudia talked about, or this is fleabane. Those are actually better suited based on our flower watches. Those are better suited or more favored by the micro-wasps than some of the flowers like this, which are big and showy. And indeed, when we looked at the visits that bumblebees made, bumblebees visited 80% of the flowers they visited were the showy flowers that you found that were seeded in the seed mixes, whereas about 40% of the flowers that the micro wasps visited were those seeded flowers. Many of them were just the wild, small, white flowers. So that's something that we're trying to tweak our seed mix to take into account. What about pollination? I showed you this. The squashes tended to be heavier next to the fallow control. And one thing we know is that squash or cucurbids in general, the intensity of the pollination affects the size of the fruit. So perhaps this is a reflection of the fact that there was better pollination. Now, there's the seed mix A, there's the fallow control. We did find more bees here, but what might be happening is what I'm calling the Walmart effect, that if you're a poor little squash flower next to something like that, the bees just fly right over you. They want to get into where all the gold is in here. Whereas if you're a flower that looks like this, and you're next to something like that, hey, they feel pretty lucky. They found a flower, and they might get better pollination because they're next to something that's not so tempting. And we have some experimental evidence for this that I could talk about later. And just another example of building the sluice, if you want to have your field out here getting beneficials, I mentioned that there's about after 600 feet, the beneficials start to taper out. And what we think might be happening is that, they don't move as far into the field, but how do you get services out here? Well, one thing is to build hedgerows that are actually guiding them out. So again, thinking of sluices that are moving the insects out deeper into the field where they might be able to service more of the crops. So again, take home 3, nature's not an iron tool, it's an enigmatic companion. There's a lot of this that you have to try to experiment in the particular place you are with the particular crops that you have. And just to wrap up, this is a very general part, but I think it's important. I've talked about some of these little nitty-gritty details, but none of this is going to come together or work unless you have an overall system that encourages it. There's building the mill. But what is the landscape you're in? How do you create an overall regenerative agrarian landscape that allows you to use insect flows in this way? Well, part of it is building your soil fertility so that you have plants that are more resistant to pests. Part of it is having cultivars that are more resistant to pests. This is apple cultivars, this is plum curculio damage, just a lot of variability in there. You'd have to go into whatever it is that you're trying to grow, but that was one aspect. One thing to remember too is that you really have to think about what are our expectations. And I think achieving your expectations means changing sometimes your expectations, not just achieving them. And when you look at an oak leaf like this that has co-evolved for millennia, what you find is that it still has a lot of pest damage. And it's not likely that we're going to have a crop system, a natural crop system, in which you don't have some damage. What are your expectations? It's important to think about. And finally, just talking a little bit about, again, expectations, is that this is a sonogram, this is sound in a conventional apple orchard and an organic orchard. The lightness here indicates this is time, this is frequency, that you have a lot of insect life over here, not so much insect life over here. And at the same time, what do your apples look like? This is the conventional orchard, and that's the organic orchard. And if you think about the customer, the consumer, they're going to want to buy this, right? And she only buys apples from quiet orchards. But so this is something about how do you sort of work with the consumer in order to change something? So this is a little bit of a bad example, maybe, but so you have something like that that's more acceptable. And I'm going to jump through that, but the whole economic system is important. And finally, this is the last slide, just that how do you build this into a landscape scale vision? This is the New England Food Vision, very interesting work. If you haven't seen it, look it up. This is a map of 2060 of how they think New England could look if they tripled the amount of food production but kept it sustainable in other ways. So all I'm saying is that the reality starts in your head. And think of what your regenerative landscape looks like. What are all the parts to this? Some of it is the nitty-gritty insect flow, and some of it is these larger scale issues. So yeah, that's what I've just said. I won't worry about that. Here you are coming home. You're almost there. And I just want to definitely thank the rest of the crew, some of whom are here, who have been out sorting insects with us, Anne for all her help, and the rest of the people at the Farm Hub and the farmers there who have helped us, and our home institution. And I just want to give you a preview of what's coming. This is a very unusual organism that you'll actually hear a couple of different people talking about. So.
Thanks, Conrad. Questions?
Hi. I was wondering if this research or any of the graphs or anything you were using is online or available.
There is some on our website. I can actually post this on our website too. You can get links probably. We can talk at lunch, and I'll give you links. And there are lots of graphs that I could have shown you. So if anybody really wants to see more details, I'd be glad to share it. Anything else? Yeah.
So I have a comment regarding the healthiest squares.
He's a
that you show.
hydrologist too, so I got to work on it.
So you have like a fallow ground where the squash were bigger. So this is my hypothesis. There might be a reason the nutrients flow there more than the other two plots.
Yeah.
So that is my hypothesis. So we need to figure out what could be the mechanism that the nutrients flow there more than the others. So for example, if all these flowers take up the nutrients from that particular site, then they may not get that right across from that plot. So that is my hypothesis.
Yeah, and then it may very well be something like that. It's possible. We did look at the soil conditions in each of those, not in the squash, which we should have done perhaps, but in the native meadow test plots themselves. And there was not much difference in available nutrients, at least when you looked in the plots themselves. But yeah, that could be something like that.
I'm just wondering about the broccoli.
The poor broccoli, which I ignored. Yeah, what happened with the broccoli is I'm not a farmer, and I planted the broccoli in amongst the squash, and the squash did really well, and the poor broccoli got a bit swamped. It did grow up along one side along one set of plots. There wasn't really enough production to say much of the production, but the pattern I showed you in pest damage held also for the broccoli. So there were more probably cabbage white worms on the broccoli next to not next to the fallow, and there was more insect damage not next to the fallow as well.
Because the flea beetles were in the fallow field.
Yeah, there were more flea beetles in the fallow, and that might be also why there's more wasps. That's another suggestion that there's more prey. And it may all just be a fluke. Next year we're going to repeat it. It may turn out completely different, but yeah.
In terms of so on our farm we have a hedgerow. One of our hedgerows is right in the middle of we have crops on one side and cattle pasture on the other, but the hedgerow doesn't connect to the woodland. So right. I'm just wondering if it seems, based on your conversation about the flow, that by connecting that hedgerow to the actual woodland, there might be some benefit just with the transportation corridor.
Yeah, possibly. It depends on who, I think the flying insects, it's not going to make so much of a difference. And actually when they do beetle banks, which are not quite hedgerows, but somewhat similar in England, they've actually not connected them because they don't want the predators of the birds that might be nesting there to follow those hedgerows out into the beetle banks in that sense. But I think from the beneficials, I think they find habitat islands, many of them. So it may not, I don't have a lot of data, I don't have any data, but I don't know that would be a problem, would be my sense. Thank you very much.
Right,
Thanks
thank you.
you all for coming.